All right, so now we're going to look at the FS module, which allows us to use Node.js to work with the local file system. So if we want to create a file, if we want to read from a file, create folders, move files around, then we can use this module. So what I'm going to do is create a new folder called Node Core Modules. I don't want to call it Node Modules because that's a little confusing with the standard Node Modules folder. So I'm going to open this up with VS Code, and for each lesson we'll have a separate file. So I'm going to just call this one fs.js, and in order to run it we need to use Node. So I'm going to open up my integrated terminal so we can just say node fs to run the file. So let's start off by bringing this in. So we're going to say require, and we want to require the fs module. And the first thing I want to look at is writing to a file, or creating and writing to a file. Now, with all the different methods that we have available to us, there's an asynchronous version, which is the default, and then there's a synchronous version. On top of that, we can choose to use callbacks, which is the default for asynchronous versions, or we can use promises. Now, if you're going to use promises, then it's going to be fs/promises, like that. All right, and I'll show you that. I'll show you all of them, but I just wanted to let you know that. So the first one we're going to look at is going to be the async, let's say callback version. So it's an asynchronous with a callback, which is basically the default. So let's say fs.write file, and this is going to take in three things. One is going to be the file name, so we'll say file1.txt. Then the content for the file, so we'll just say hello world, and then a callback. So we'll pass in a function, and then that can actually take in an error value, and we can check for the error. So just say if error, then we'll just throw error. And then let's just do a console log and say file created. So if I run this with node fs, we should see the file created console log, and we should see file1.txt, and has the content of hello world. So that's the callback version. Now, if you want to use a promise, so if you want to use .then syntax, or even a sync await, which I'll show you, that's what I would choose. To do that, what we're going to do is bring in fs/promises. Okay, so now let's come down here and we'll say promise version, and it's going to be fs.write file, and we're going to pass in the same thing. So the name, let's say file2.txt, and we'll say hello world 2. And instead of passing in a callback, I'm gonna tack on a .then. Right, so we'll say .then, and that's going to take in a function, and then we can do what we want with, after creating the file. So we'll just do a console log and say file created. Let's stay consistent with the casing. So file created, and then to check for an error, we can do a .catch. So right here, let's say .catch. That takes in a function with a possible error, and then we'll console.log that error. All right, now I'm going to comment out this, and then we'll run the file again. We should see the same thing. File created, we see file2.txt with hello world 2. Now, for the synchronous version, you would use just the regular fs, and then let's come down here. Actually, I'm going to comment this out, and let's say sync version. So for this, we can just say fs.write file sync, and just takes in two things. It's going to take the file name, so let's call this one file3.txt, and for the content we'll say hello world 3, and that's it. Then we would just do our console log and say file created. So let's run this. We get file created, and we get our file 3. So in this case, anything that's below this line is not going to happen until this file is created. With our asynchronous versions, it'll create the file, the code will continue, and then when this is done getting created, then the callback will fire off. Now, the last version I'm going to show you is the promise version, but using a sync await. And this is what I would use personally. And you would usually put these in a function rather than just running them globally. But I'm going to comment that out, and I'm going to use promises. And I'll just say async await. And just to keep the rest of this video simple, we're going to use this method for the rest of for the rest of the methods that I'm going to show you. So let's say async function create file, and we're going to pass in here, it's going to take a file name and it'll take the content to be written to the file. And we're using a sync await, so to handle errors we usually use a try catch. So that's what I'm going to use, and in the try we'll say await and then fs.write file, and that's going to take in the file name that's passed into the function and the content. Okay, and then we'll just do another console log and say file created. And then if there's an error, then we'll just do a console log of that error. All right, and then of course we need to call this, so we'll say create file, pass in a name, let's say file4.txt, and we'll say hello world 4. Okay, so everything else is commented out, so if we run the file, there we go, we get file 4 and hello world 4. So this is what I would suggest, or I shouldn't say suggest, but that's what I would use. And this is the way that we're going to look at the rest of these methods. All right, so let's just comment that out. And now I'm going to show you how we can read from a file. So let's say read from a file. So I'm going to create an asynchronous function, and we'll call this read file, and we'll pass in a file name. So we're going to use a try catch here, and the method is called read file. Like this is our read file, but the method on the fs object is also called read file. So let's say const data and set that to await fs.read file, and then there is a read file sync as well, and you could use it synchronously. But this is going to take in the file name and then the encoding, which I want to do UTF-8. Okay, and then what we'll do is just console log the data. That should be the content that's in the file. If there's an error, then we'll console log that error. So let's call this. I'm going to say read file, and let's read file1.txt. Okay, now we can run the file or run our fs.js, and you can see in the console we see hello world. Okay, I could actually read multiple files, so let's do 2, 3, and now we see hello world 2, hello world 3, and hello world. So that's a read file. Now if you want to delete a file, let's do that next. So delete a file. And the function name, or I should say the method name for that is unlink. But we're going to create a function called delete file. So async function delete file, and that's going to take in file name. And then let's do our try catch. And in our try, we're going to await, because this returns a promise. And then fs.unlink is the method that we want. We pass in the file name, and then let's go ahead and just do a console log, and let's use some backticks, and we'll say file name deleted. All right, and then down here we'll just console log error if there is one. So now let's come down here and say delete file, and let's delete file, let's do 4.txt. Okay, so now I'll come down here, we'll run node fs, and you saw that file 4 just got deleted, and it says file 4.txt deleted. Now, if you want to rename a file, there's a rename method. So let's look at that next. So we'll say rename a file, and we'll create an async function called rename file. And we're going to take in two things. Obviously, we want the old name and we want the new name. So let's do a try catch, and let's say await fs dot rename, so that's the name of the method, rename, and takes in the same arguments that our function takes in, old name and new name. Okay, then we want to do a console log, and let's put in some backticks, and we'll say file old name, so file old name renamed to the new name. Okay, and then console log error, and then we want to call that, so let's go down here and say rename file, and let's rename file1.txt to file.txt. Okay, we'll run it, and there we go. So now file 1 was renamed to just file. Now you can also work with folders, right? So let's create a folder, a folder. So we'll have an async function, create folder, and we're just going to pass in here a folder name. And the name of the method is makedir, MKDIR. If you're familiar with the terminal, that's what you would use in the terminal to create a new folder. So let's do a try catch, and we're going to await. So await fs.makedir, which stands for make directory. And then we'll pass in the folder name, and we'll do a console log, and let's say folder, and then the folder name created. Okay, and then we just want to console log error, and then we'll come down here, let's say create folder, and we'll call this folder 1. Let's run it. Oops. And there we go. So folder 1 was now created. Now there's other methods that are available on the FS module, and if you want to look at the documentation, you can do that. In fact, I have the documentation link right here, and I'll just paste that in. Okay, and also all the ones we looked at, like rename and unlink, these all have a synchronous version as well if you need that. So in the next video, we're going to look at the path module.